On August 20th, 2018, at approximately 10:13 hours, I responded to a shots fired call with the subject down at. Upon my arrival on the scene, I observed a burgundy Saturn sedan with registration plate number parked stationary within the driveway. As I approached the vehicle, I observed a black male subject, later determined to be the first victim recorded in this case, wearing gray sweatpants and a black undershirt, lying on the ground beside the passenger side of the vehicle within a pool of blood. The passenger side door was open. The black male subject was wearing blue Nike tennis shoes, and his left foot was still inside of the vehicle within the open passenger door, and the remainder of his body was upon the ground. The black male was facing towards the street on the passenger side of the vehicle, lengthwise against the passenger side rear door. I performed a pulse check of the subject and was unable to detect a pulse, at which point I began to perform CPR. During this time, I observed another black male subject, later determined to be the second victim recorded within this case, sitting on the front porch steps of the residence. The male was breathing, but was bleeding heavily from his chest. I told him that help was on the way and that he needed to focus on remaining awake and calm. I then refocused my attention to the first victim due to him not currently showing any signs of life, and who appeared to be in a much more critical medical condition. As I was performing CPR, I observed a large amount of blood which appeared to be being pushed out of the chest area of the victim. During this time, I also observed several spent shell casings lying on the ground around where victim 1 was lying, which were hidden from my view until I had moved the victim to begin CPR. EMS personnel arrived on scene and began performing emergency assessments of the victim's status and looking for other injuries as I continued CPR. Officer took over for chest compressions for me after I had been performing CPR for nearly 7 minutes. I then assisted EMS in cutting off victim 1's clothing and removed his shoes and the socks that he wore. There was an unknown quantity of money which had been placed within the sock of victim 1's right foot, which I never counted on scene. I placed the clothing, socks, and shoes of victim 1 by his feet. Not long after EMS had assumed life-saving measures for victim 1, I was notified by the EMS supervisor on scene that they had not detected any change in signs of life and that the victim was being declared deceased. This occurred at 10:25 hours. The deceased male subject was later identified as a Mr. who was later determined to live at. The victim's body was covered up with a white sheet by EMTs on scene. I proceeded to escort EMS personnel to a local area trauma center while they transported victim 2, who was later identified to be a Mr. While in transit to the trauma center, I heard victim 2 make the utterance that he knew who had shot him, but that he didn't know the shooter's name. Considering the critical status of victim 2's injuries and his survival status unknown at that time, I attempted to conduct a field interview of victim 2 in the event that he died as a result of his injuries before a statement could be obtained. I asked victim 2 what had occurred, and he provided the following statement. Victim 2 reported that victim 1 had been a passenger within his vehicle at the time this incident occurred. He reported that victim 1 had been speaking to the primary suspect on the telephone just prior to the shooting, complaining that a bag of dope victim 1 had purchased from the suspect was not good enough. Victim 2 reported that 10 minutes later he and victim 1 were sitting outside of another subject's residence when they observed a black sedan with tinted windows arrive on the street behind their vehicle. Victim 2 reported that he exited his driver's door of his vehicle to see who had pulled up behind them. When he observed the driver's side window to the vehicle going down, the driver producing a handgun, and the driver shooting an unknown number of times in the direction of victims 1 and 2. Victim 2 reported that when he had been shot, he felt his entire body go numb and fell to the ground. Victim 2 reported that as he laid upon the ground with his back flat to the earth, that the suspect stood over victim 2 and fired once into his chest, prior to turning the gun towards where victim 1 was positioned within the vehicle and firing several times. Victim 2 reported further that the suspect was tall with a dark skin complexion and long dreadlocks, who was wearing a black t-shirt and jeans at the time of the shooting. Victim 2 reported that he heard between 4 and 5 gunshots as he was lying on the ground after he'd been shot in the chest. Victim 2 stated that he climbed to his feet once the suspect had left and crawled to the front steps of the residence, where I contacted him initially upon my arrival. Upon our arrival on the scene to the hospital, a physician attending to Victim 2 reported that he'd been shot once in his right arm, once in his left arm, and once in the center of his chest. The crime lab met me on the scene at the hospital and collected photographs and physical evidence from the victim. I was informed shortly afterwards by medical staff that Victim 2 would have to be sedated to be prepared for surgery. I left the scene and returned to the scene of the shooting. I assisted in the collection of evidence from this scene and concluded my involvement. On August 20th of 2018 at approximately 10:45 hours, I responded to the scene where officers had reported a shooting had occurred, resulting in the homicide of at least one individual and the serious wounding of at least one other individual. Detective and I responded to the scene together, and upon our arrival we were informed of the situation by officers. Detective, who had already arrived on the scene, reported that several witnesses had been identified in the area and that officers were doing their best to speak to them. I was informed by officers on the scene that a witness who had observed the entire incident was willing to provide a formal statement. I escorted this witness back to the police department, where a formal audio-video recorded interview was conducted. The witness reported that he was just around the corner from the residence where the shooting occurred when he heard several sets of gunshots ring out. The witness reported that once all of the shooting had concluded, that a black sedan drove by his location on the sidewalk, at which time the driver rolled down his window, produced a handgun which he pointed directly at the witness, prior to saying, "You didn't see, homie." The witness reported that the driver fired the handgun once in the direction of the witness, which missed him, and that he began running for his life in the opposite direction, towards a wood line. Detective informed us that he would assume any further interviews at the police department, and that the detective lieutenant had requested me and my partner to respond back to the residence in reference to a search warrant being issued for the property. My partner and I responded back to the scene of the shooting and made contact with the crime lab, who had reported locating one of the victim's cell phones, which had been used to contact the suspect just prior to the victim's murder. In accordance with state case law, I made the decision to utilize the deceased subject's right thumb to unlock his telephone, and did this beneath rulings regarding decedents having no expectation of privacy for personal electronic devices, and in an attempt to determine the suspect's identity and/or telephone number to better investigate this case. Several telephone numbers and contact listings were located, and the suspect's phone number was ultimately found. Once this had occurred, the battery died shortly after. The device was seized and secured into evidence. Following a review of the scene, my partner and I traveled to a local trauma center where another victim was undergoing surgery. I was informed upon my arrival that the victim would be out of surgery soon and was expected to live, but with complications. I made contact with this victim once he awoke from surgery several hours later and received a formal statement from him. Ultimately, the victim was able to provide details related to the alias and potential phone number used by the suspect just prior to the shooting, and I used this information to apply for an emergency request from the suspect's cell phone provider for his identity as linked to the phone number he used. An hour after submitting this emergency request, I was provided the name of the customer which had been associated with the suspect's phone number. Upon reviewing local files of this individual and matching this file to descriptions provided by several witnesses and the victim I'd spoken to at the hospital, I was able to determine the likely identity of the suspect. I provided this information to other detectives, including the lead detective for this case. I received information from another detective involved in this case and decided to speak to the Assistant District Attorney regarding the statement provided by Victim 2. I received authorization and guidance to conduct a photo lineup for Victim 2, which possessed the photograph of the suspect that we had identified from cell phone records. The photo lineup was conducted on scene at the hospital, and Victim 2 correctly pointed out the suspect that we'd identified on his first attempt and with an accuracy of 100%. I made contact with the Assistant District Attorney again in reference to this revelation, and he instructed me that the evidence that we had obtained thus far was suitable for issuing warrants for the suspect. I immediately met on scene at the courthouse with other detectives involved in this case and applied for several warrants for the suspect's arrest. The magistrate saw probable cause to issue these warrants, and upon receiving same, I instructed communications to issue emergency alerts to all local area law enforcement agencies that the suspect was now wanted and at large. Regarding the suspect's previous involvements related to violent crime and gun crime in particular, the suspect had been arrested more than 10 times for firing a firearm into an occupied dwelling. At least 3 of these incidents left victims behind. The suspect had been charged with first-degree murder at least 1 time before our warrants were drawn. The next day, I received word from communications that the suspect had been apprehended by a federal fugitive task force in a neighboring city without issue. I responded to the location where the suspect had been arrested and assumed custody of him prior to transporting him back to the police department. On scene at the police department, I began formal interview proceedings with the suspect, who, upon being asked only one question, demanded his attorney and invoked the Fifth Amendment. The suspect was handed off to officers for booking and was later transported to the local area jail to await further proceedings. He was confined beneath a no bond in reference to his charge of first-degree murder.